For the Washington Examiner, I'm Suraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. On February 3rd, the first in the nation caucuses take place in Iowa for the Democratic nomination. And everything is getting really tight between four candidates: Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg. To talk about it is Naomi Lim. She's a politics reporter at the Washington Examiner. So Naomi, first of all, let's get into the New York Times editorial board, because what they did is announce that they're breaking with tradition in endorsing two candidates, one of which is Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, and then Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota. First of all, what is your biggest takeaway from this? How does this impact their two campaigns?
Well, first of all, I think it's also important to note that historic in the nature in terms of two women being endorsed by the publication. Not only were there two, but it was two women. And I think it was really intriguing that they almost hedged their bets, right? Because they chose a center-left candidate in Amy Klobuchar, and then a far-left candidate in Elizabeth Warren. So I think it shows you, one, the desire for a bit of change, but two, also just the really fluid nature of this race, that even the New York Times in its endorsement couldn't pick a lane, for lack of a better expression. But to put this into a broader context, I think there's like a broader media discussion in terms of how much an endorsement actually matters. I mean, in 2008, I think the New York Times endorsed Hillary Clinton, and of course Barack Obama went on to win the nomination, and then the White House in the fall. So I think that there's you have to look at it in a greater context in terms of what it actually means and whether it actually parlays into any votes. You saw Joe Biden, for example, today, his campaign was spinning the fact that his viral video that was taken from a clip from the New York Times' reveal of a voter in the elevator with him actually went viral and got more views than the announcement videos for Warren and Klobuchar. So it's, in context, it's great for a news day and one big, great positive news cycle for both Klobuchar and Warren, but in terms of what it means for the rest of the race, it's still to be seen. And I think, I know there was the perception that Bernie Sanders got snubbed, but if you think about it in context, does Bernie Sanders really want a legacy newspaper to endorse him when his whole message is about being against the establishment?
The New York Times actually called Bernie Sanders just as divisive as President Trump when he was running in 2016, and then called on Joe Biden to sort of pass the baton. Is this sort of resonate better or recharge or reinvigorate their respective bases?
I think for Bernie Sanders, rhetoric like that certainly does charge his base, considering that's something that unites them and galvanizes them against, more mainstream politicians. Joe Biden, of course, that hurts him a little bit. Joe Biden has faced those questions not only from voters, but also from the New York Times in the actual editorial meeting, where he jokingly accused them of being ageist because they asked whether there should be an upper age limit on the presidency. But I think that those are questions that he's faced on the campaign trail. He counters them with the fact that, we're going into this potentially another administration where you need more experience after the, cowboyism, if you're a critic of the president, how that's how you would describe how he's run this White House. And I think that he kind of uses it to his advantage. So it hurts Biden to an extent, but he's also been prepared to. It's not a new accusation that's been lobbed at him.
Let's now turn to an issue that's come up in the last 48 hours. Senator Sanders. CNN reported yesterday and Senator Warren confirmed in a statement that in 2018, you told her that you did not believe that a woman could win the election. Why did you say that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't say it. And I don't want to waste a whole lot of time on this, because this is what Donald Trump and maybe some of the media want. Anybody knows me, knows that it's incomprehensible that I would think that a woman could not be president of the United States.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
I disagreed. Bernie is my friend, and I am not here to try to fight with Bernie. But look, this question about whether or not a woman can be president has been raised, and it's time for us to attack it head on. And I think the best way to talk about who can win is by looking at people's winning record. So, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women, Amy and me.
In the midst of all this, there's been a running feud between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. There's been a lot of back and forth, and a lot of it seemed to spawn from this report in CNN in which Sanders and Warren met in December of 2018 to sort of discuss that both of them were going to run for president. And then what CNN reported from this meeting was that Elizabeth Warren was told by Sanders that a woman cannot win the presidency, or at least win this presidential election. How has this kind of shaped and molded the presidential race right now?
Well, I think it's just indicative of the fact that the knives are out. I think if you're a fan of contact sports, you would have watched this primary and been bitterly disappointed, because while there was friction between the centre-left candidates and the left candidates, there was very little interaction between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, when the conversation that they put forward is actually shaped the primary. We wouldn't have considered Medicare for all or free college in 2016. That would have been considered too outlandish, but now it's become part of the mainstream. So I think that it was really important for them to have a conversation about distinguishing themselves. I think that it also is demonstrative of the fact that this race is too close to call, because they've gone to these extreme lengths to, I guess, wage sort of like personal attacks on each other. In 2016, Bernie Sanders was incredibly reticent to criticize Hillary. I mean, you had that famous clip of him during the debate saying, "I don't want to talk about your damn emails." But he sort of stood his ground in this fight. The same goes with Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren is one of the most premeditated, calculated political animals that you will come across. She hardly ever missteps and is always on message. So for her to not only make this I mean, there are allegations about the fact whether her campaign were the ones that planted this report. There were only 2 people that were privy to their conversations. So I think that if you were a betting person, I think that that is a safer bet than otherwise. Yeah, so basically, she wouldn't have done this if she didn't think that she could reap some kind of reward. Now, it's been a couple of days since this initial report came out. You saw her double down on it during the debate, where she turned it into an attack line against Sanders, where she sort of said, you know, out of all the people on this stage, the only people who have won all of their elections in the past 30 years are the women. Obviously, he countered that with his assertion that he actually won against a Republican exactly 30 years ago. So she didn't research it quite well. And then she did this as an outsider, it looked incredibly orchestrated, where she refused to shake his hand after the debate. She knew she was doing that in front of a bank of TV cameras and mics and boom mics and all of those things. So for her, that was like a very deliberate move.
And you have that hot mic moment as well that got released by CNN almost the day after the debate.
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion, we'll have that discussion. You called me, you told me. All right, let's not do it now.
I don't want to get in the middle of it. I just want to say hi, Bernie.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Do you think she knew what she was doing in that regard too?
I mean, I think that it would be a good guess to say that she did. I mean, it also showed that she was, as I said, she doesn't often lose her cool. So there's something about that interaction that really struck a nerve with her. But even though I said that it was a calculated, deliberative move, we're sort of still seeing it shake down, and I don't know who came off the better of the pair of them, actually.
A lot of observers of this particular spat between Warren and Sanders have sort of given it the Me Too treatment in a way, that, it's a he said, she said, doesn't obviously meet the standard of, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, or sexual assault. But at the same time, this is a pretty charged comment to make at another person, given that, a woman has not been president of the United States. And because it didn't happen on cameras and it happened in the backroom meeting, we have no idea 100% one way or the other whether it actually happened. do you think if this would be treated differently in a not like in a say before the Me Too era?
Potentially. I mean, I think both the general public and the media are still grappling with how to handle these conversations. I think that definitely in the aftermath of the report, a lot of blue checks on Twitter were sort of saying, or trying to explain away Bernie's denial of the situation. They sort of said maybe he meant this and she misunderstood it, rather than taking Warren at her word, because it's really hard when you have two respective figures how to, I guess, marry those two stories. And then I think you almost had where you went too, I don't know whether it was going too far, but there was definitely almost like an overcorrection by CNN, because during the debate, they asked Sanders to comment on the story. He said he didn't do it. The CNN moderator didn't even really acknowledge his response and went straight to Warren and said, just ignoring what Sanders' dismissal, what did you respond to that conversation? And I think that almost caught more flack as opposed to the other original reporting from it.
Yeah, we actually saw CNN almost being, I would say, canceled as a result by Bernie supporters, because it seemed Abby Phillip, the CNN moderator, who sort of posited that question, seemed to almost suggest that this was something that definitively happened, as opposed to, well, maybe it happened, there's still room for doubt.
And I think the other sort of sad thing about this whole situation is that trying to figure out how voters feel about it, because really at the end it's them who matter, rather than this sort of internal navel gazing that we have as the media. And it's sort of interesting because I've heard just anecdotally that men, viewed that as a very sneaky attack to dish on a private conversation. So they come at it as a more of a negative towards Warren. Women who look at the situation, they kind of say, well, that kind of echoes true, right? It might have been a charged thing to say, but I think it would be foolish not to realize that there was some truth in it. Mm-hmm. And then that was doubled down by comments that Sanders made on the weekend, where he essentially said, you know what, I have my own weaknesses. I'm 78 years old. And, females in this race have weaknesses as well, and as a woman. And I think that again, it caused a little bit of flat online, but I think that the Democratic Party would be foolish not to consider the ramifications of putting a woman onto the top of the ticket for November. Right,
because I could totally see the scenario in which Bernie Sanders, and Michael Avenatti actually said this before when he was still like the media darling, is that the only way to beat Trump is if you're like a white cis male. And that was one of the things that at the time when Avenatti said this on pretty much in the public display, there was either on Twitter or on TV, wasn't really given as much thought. But if we're looking at here, I could totally see Bernie Sanders saying, in this particular scenario, against Donald Trump, seeing as how in 2016 a woman could not defeat Trump, he doesn't believe that a woman could defeat Trump in 2020. Is that a similar read that you would have of it, or do you think there's probably a different interpretation that you would glean from it?
I mean, I think that, I feel as though Donald Trump is an enigma that it's very hard for Democrats to try and figure out how to poke holes in his situation, because there are still so many things that are unknown. We don't know how this impeachment trial is going to affect the general, and we don't know what unforeseen things that they'll have to, whether the economy will tank between now and November. There are all these different things to try and figure out how to best confront him on his message. So I think there's truth to that, but I mean, like a Pete Buttigieg would disagree with you. He's not, an alpha male. He says that he puts off Donald Trump because Donald Trump doesn't know how to pigeonhole him, and there's a whole other sort of case to unpack with that. I think though it's sort of trying to figure out how to bring people to the base, and I think the other thing, going back to your Me Too question, is that we sort of saw this reiteration of Bernie Sanders supporters, using hashtags like, Warren or bust, or Warren is a snake. And I think that is sort of a very dangerous dividing thing for the Democratic base when you want to unite them behind a certain candidate.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because and in light of these allegations, in light of the CNN report about this private conversation between Warren and Sanders, this kind of doubling down by Warren and this doubling down by Sanders in his denial, a lot of Bernie supporters, and I would argue that it probably expanded to more than that. I'm sure it's Warren critics as well, basically have been charging her as someone who is a quote unquote snake. What is sort of the symbolism behind that? Because that, for a lot of people who don't understand, is a very misogynistic, sexist characterization.
Yeah. So I think the feeling is that Bernie Sanders supporters feel as though Elizabeth Warren stabbed them in the back. And it's a very delicate dance that Elizabeth Warren is trying to weave, because from the outset of this campaign, she tried to sort of lean into Bernie's left support, almost not quite outflanking him, but trying to meet him. And I think the idea was that she would try and capture some of his vote if he were to stumble. I think unfortunately for her, this is a planned mantra, and then Bernie's just sort of persistence, despite having a heart attack, he's still out fundraising the whole entire field, and is still doing really well in the polls. And so I think that there was this idea that she could try and win them over, and this was sort of like a, looking at it now, she might realize that it's not. It's a harder thing to do in practice.
It's almost like a
theoretical.
backup quarterback,
Exactly,
and
exactly.
with Warren being the backup and Bernie being the all-star starter.
Yeah.
Basically, taking the left wing. Do you see that this is almost? I hate to
More sports analogies.
Yeah,
on me?
I hate to make sports analogies here, but it's hard to see how Warren comes out on top of this.
I know, and well, at the moment, I mean, like this race again is so competitive, and like every day is different, and there's a different thing that they have to engage with on the campaign trail. But it is like, I do feel that her momentum has been blunted. I don't know whether it happened before this or whether it happened sort of earlier in the fall, but there's something happening in the water. But we also have to just take a pause, because I did mention that the hashtag went viral.
Right.
We don't know how much of that was actually organic and how much of that was potentially like online trolls, or like, there's a lot of speculation among Democratic strategists that I've spoken to that potentially that's like another sort of, there's a potential for foreign interference in terms of pushing that hashtag. So it's hard to know, where the reality versus online merges with that.
I mean, they always say Twitter isn't real life. How much of that actually bleeds into real life?
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about how the impeachment trial is impacting the Iowa caucuses and the Democratic primary as a whole. It really harms Sanders, Warren, and Klobuchar, two of which have already received the New York Times endorsement, because they all of a sudden have to stay in Washington as opposed to campaigning in Iowa. Do you believe, or do you buy the theory that first of all, does the impeachment trial of Donald Trump hurt those three senators in particular? And secondly, do you think that there was any reason to believe that Nancy Pelosi delayed articles of impeachment to sort of interfere in the 2020 Democratic primary?
So to tackle your first question first, there is no question that this impeachment trial hurts Bernie or Sanders, Warren, and Klobuchar. Iowa and all the first in the nation sort of states, retail politics there is king. And while their competitors like Buttigieg and Biden are kissing babies and shaking hands, they're stuck in Washington 6 days a week, reportedly till late at night and for an unknown period of time. So they're at a distinct disadvantage. I mean, the only way that they could potentially leverage this to their advantage is if they can get onto as many cable news networks, because they're going to be part of this cast of characters for historic proceedings. Mm-hmm. The only problem is we don't know how much cable news that Iowa Democrats are going to be watching.
Right.
You've seen a lot of the campaign schedules that have come out in recent weeks, they didn't really quite know how this was going to affect them, so they would sort of put a note at the end of their email saying, this is all subject to change. But we saw on the weekend when the timeline crystallized, Sanders has scheduled himself to be out there in Iowa this week at sort of like a late rally. I don't quite know if he's going to make that. He is, because we don't know how long he'll be stuck in the Senate chamber for. What we do know is that he has the benefit of having a whole lot of money behind him where he can charter planes. We don't quite know how much cash on hand all the campaigns have, but it's widely understood that he raised over $90 million last year. So he has some cash to burn. And, with 2 weeks out from the Iowa caucuses, now is the time to do it. I think it obviously helps Buttigieg because he's out there. It still is yet to be seen how much this hurts or helps or hinders Biden, since he is a central part of this impeachment inquiry. But again, that's something that remains to be seen.
As far as Pelosi goes,
yeah.
what is your read on this? Because there have been theories floating around that Pelosi could have held the articles of impeachment longer to sort of interfere in the 2020 Democratic primary. Where do you think, what's the credence that you would give to that theory?
So I think there are definitely rumblings, particularly among Sanders supporters. And I think a lot of that was latched onto by Republicans because it helps undermine Nancy Pelosi. I mean, her stated aim of holding on to the impeachment articles was to draw attention to the fact that the Senate trial process was unfair without calling witnesses and things like that. I don't necessarily think that she played those political games knowing that she would hurt Sanders and Warren, who obviously are not, part of the establishment. But I also don't know whether she minds that she did, because she has to think about protecting the Democrats' House majority and then obviously she would like more help in the Senate. So she has all those down ticket ballots, like races to think about. So I think it was maybe just a convenient run-on effect.
On the actual Iowa caucuses, 2020 presents a new rule change, and there are a few numbers that voters or observers or political wonks need to remember. First is 15%. So any candidate who gets above 15% in the voting threshold in the tally is basically viable. They achieve some viability to attain delegates. The second number that people need to remember is 3, and that's for 3 different results. The first result being the first expression of preference, also known as, for layman's terms, the first round of voting. This is where all candidates tallied up before that 15% cutoff or realignment is determined. The second one is the final expression of preference. This could be either the second or the final round of voting, in which the tally is basically after the 15% realignment. And then the third is the state equivalent of delegates. And the way to explain this is that there are a reported total number of state delegate equivalents and then national delegates. And this is the ratio of state to county convention delegates determined by the final expression of preference of each of Iowa's 1,679 precincts or caucus sites. Best way to explain this is, say, for example, if you look at 2016, Clinton won 701 Iowa state delegate equivalents, or 49.9% of the vote. Sanders won 697, amounting to 49.6% of the vote. And then former governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, won 8, or 0.6%. When you translate that into national delegates, that's 23 pledged Iowa delegates to the Democratic National Committee convention to Hillary Clinton, 21 for Sanders, and then 0 for O'Malley. Obviously, this is very complicated in the sense that I had to explain this by reading off of my script here. And how does that complicate it in terms of when we look at the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd?
So I think the thing to remember is we might not know the results. It's like so much easier in a primary where you just tabulate results. I mean, like that's subject to, different elections where it's been very too close to call. So we might not know straight away who won. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing is to remember is that with all of these results being reported, there are so many more opportunities for campaigns to spin what actually happens on the night. So traditionally, there's this sort of saying that there are 3 tickets out of Iowa. If you're on the top 3, you sail into New Hampshire with plenty of momentum. Now, if you potentially come 4th or something like that, you may, and because using that total delegate count that you were talking about, maybe in that first round of voting, you actually did really well. So you and your campaign supporters can go out onto different outlets and sort of say, you know what, there's still momentum behind my campaign. I can still move forward. I don't have to suspend yet. It just makes this whole campaign experience where this primary experience where it was already historically large, and the idea was that we'd hopefully winnow it out. It just prolongs that process. I think the other thing to remember from the Iowa caucuses, and particularly the way that impeachment will affect it, is that again, with this idea of how campaigns might spin the results, is that potentially if Warren, who actually has or even Sanders, who has a high expectations game coming into Iowa, they can potentially argue that the impeachment trial hurt their chances. So when we go into New Hampshire, where those two are in fact neighboring senators, so the expectations on them are equally high there, it's just another way to try and, I guess, rally their base and get money still, because money is going to be so important for them going past February and into Super Tuesday.
Lastly, based on your reporting, who would you say is the odds-on bet to not say win the Iowa caucuses, but come out with the most momentum?
Okay, because I thought you were going to ask me, and it's about placing a bet, and we can't do that
Right.
as reporters.
But, I mean, we can't, but there are people who would think this is the safest choice to win the Iowa caucuses, or at least gain the most out of it.
I think that's, as I keep saying, the race is incredibly hard to call at the moment. Within the top three, I think using polling aggregation methods, I think only 2 or 3 percentage points separate them. If you expand that out to Warren, that's only 4%. So it's incredibly hard to choose. The other factor to take in mind is that a record number of Iowans still don't know who they're going to vote for, and that's 2 weeks out from when they actually gather to caucus. I think that you can't underestimate. I know that there's this differing opinions on the importance of ground games, but I think, on a cold February night, it matters how you organize. So when you look at that, you have Sanders, Buttigieg, and Warren having the strongest ground games. To me, I know this doesn't answer your question, but the person who has the most pressure on them, in my opinion, is Joe Biden, because he and his campaign have worked really hard to, downplay the importance of Iowa, because internal polling may suggest that he isn't as strong as the other candidates. And his whole campaign is predicated on the fact that he's going to get wins in South Carolina, where there's a strong black vote, and then in the big states in Super Tuesday. So they've been working for months now to downplay expectations on this. So I think now that polling and even betting odds has Biden gaining speed, he's the man to watch, because he has the most to lose.
Naomi Lim, politics reporter for the Washington Examiner. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our show. Subscribe to the podcast on whichever podcast app you're using, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Ricochet, Stitcher, what have you. Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Washington Examiner. And also follow us on Twitter at DC Examiner. You can also follow me on there. I'm at Suraj A. Hashmi. And by all means, tell your friends and family about the show. As always, special thanks to everyone who was involved in the creation of this podcast, from the Washington Examiner team, my family and friends, and to you, the listener, for being a part of the journey. For the Washington Examiner, I'm Suraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out.